BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. We mentioned that we're going to be starting a book discussion about The Most Dangerous Animal of All by Gary L. Stewart. And welcome to part one. Let's get going. The first thing I would like to say is, though, if you would like to check out our playlist on the Charles Manson series and the Manson family, that will be in the description box here. It was a direct response to Stephanie Harlow's channel, and she actually wrote into the show last night to check it out and just to give some kind of thanks and encouragement. So big thank you to Stephanie Harlow. Once again, that is in the description box here. But on to today's subject, talking about the Zodiac Killer. And when we go through this book here, The Most Dangerous Animal of All, we really should bear in mind that this is not so much exploring the possibility of Earl Van Best being the Zodiac Killer. What I thought would be a much more practical discussion would be to look at some of the statements that Gary Stewart is making in the book, and how does it relate to the Zodiac in general. Let's find out some things. Overall, much of the first 4 chapters that we went through here are discussing the life story of somebody who has been searching for their family members. Gary Stewart, as we said in the kind of introductory piece, he was given up for adoption when he was 2 months old. Earl Van Best had married a 15-year-old named Judith. They conceived a child. The marriage was annulled because she was only 15 at the time. Actually, Earl Van Best started pursuing Judith when she was only 13, waiting for her to come off the school bus. She came from somewhat of a verbally abusive home, for lack of a better term, and she was in a vulnerable state, and it really sounds like Earl Van Best is portrayed as a predator. He charms her with his British accent. I hope he wasn't using that all the time. That would be very, very, I don't know, just tacky if he's using a fake British accent all the time. But he was a very worldly individual, and this would be the first question that I would like to kind of ask you guys. What do you think the Zodiac Killer was like in terms of his education? And I know that sounds like a weird question, but think about it. The way they describe this guy, Van, as he's referred to in the book, someone who was very well educated, but not a good student. BC kind of student, but perhaps of above average intelligence. Earl Van Best, referred to as Van, he is like somebody who spent some time in Japan as a kid, picked up not only the Japanese language, but also the German language. He became familiar with a lot of works of literature, someone who is very good at learning, very apt for acquiring knowledge and skills and abilities, but didn't perform well at school. What do you think about that? That's the first challenge question of the day. Van begins to charm Judith with his stories of spending time in Mexico, and he takes her to a church, and he is talking about artwork, and she is just so impressed by how this person who is very, what she thinks of as well-educated and knows what he's talking about, would want to spend time with her, but she's just come from this home of verbal abuse. But in reality, Earl Van Best Jr., came from a broken home all the same. His mother had numerous affairs. His father decided to leave the family. I mean, like, the way they introduce in the book is his father really wants the divorce because his mother was having an affair, multiple affairs. But in reality, they learn later on that his father wanted the divorce so he could marry a woman much younger than him. Lots of betrayal going on, and that really does affect somebody's mental state. I mean, we've talked about the shattering of the pillars of childhood before on this channel. And, I mean, a lot of people say that the Zodiac Killer had some animosity toward women. And just the way that they describe Earl Van Best's mother, Gertrude. I mean, we're talking, yes, about Earl Van Best Jr., that is, his mother was Gertrude. She was someone who would sleep with numerous men while her father was away, so they moved from South Carolina to San Francisco. But then after the divorce, growing up in San Francisco really did not have a good impact on Van. I don't know. I really don't know, but I can say that there's a lot of animosity in the Zodiac's material toward women. And they think, though, that even with the crimes that were committed, that there's some scorn for either women or people who are romantically involved. What I can say when I was reading the early chapters here, we've done 4 chapters plus the prologue, introduction, is that I'm seeing an enormous amount of similarities between Earl Van Best as a suspect and Louis Myers as a suspect. Not only do you have somebody who is a little bit kind of like just dealing with his youth and the connections to some of the Zodiac material, code breaking, for example. Both Louis Myers and Earl Van Best have the connection that they would have learned anything about this cryptography stuff from their father, who was involved with World War II, who was in the Navy. And with Earl Van Best, you see very clearly, he's sitting down with his father, Earl Van Best Sr., learning about code breaking, learning about cryptography. His father would teach him that stuff. So, they say in this book, they didn't have a television growing up. And that was actually very normal. We're dealing with the early 1940s. The war is still going on, I believe, at this time. He didn't provide an exact year that would have been happening when he's getting like these types of cryptography lessons from his father. But Earl Van Best Jr. is just sitting there like they're doing it as kind of a game. His father would come up with these codes, and then Earl Van Best Jr. would try to unscramble them. So he's learning about that stuff. Connections to Mexico should not be downplayed either, because the Zodiac Killer has numerous things to say about Mexico, whether it's at Lake Berryessa saying that he's trying to get to Mexico, escape from Deer Lodge Prison in Montana, and he's en route to Mexico, or just talking about the Darlene Ferrin's possible connection to Mexico as well. Darlene Ferrin most likely did know somebody in Mexico. Rumor has it that even Jim Phillips Crabtree, her ex-husband, was in Mexico, but she might have even had somebody else there that could have been involved with that strange package. The Zodiac Killer has numerous things that are connected to Mexico. This also brings us to the Japanese language. Thomas Henry Horan even said it himself. The reason why the 340 cipher, that Zodiac cipher that was never solved, was unsolved to this day, is because part of it is in English and part of it is in Japanese. And he attributes that to Robert Graysmith. Because remember, Thomas Henry Horan accuses Robert Graysmith of fabricating the ciphers, and he says that the symbols come from some Filipino alphabet, and in reality, though, Robert Graysmith even talked about a possible Chinese character in the Zodiac ciphers as well. But Thomas Henry Horan says, no, that's not Chinese, that's Japanese. Well, when it comes to Earl Van Best, he studied the 3 major scripts of the Japanese language. One of them is mostly just the Chinese characters. The Japanese language uses lots of Chinese characters. It can be both. And the older forms of Korean actually also use the Chinese characters as well. So that's not really a controversial statement or even a bizarre statement. But Earl Van Best had a lot of familiarity with the Japanese language, and also with the opera The Mikado. When we were discussing Louis Myers, someone mentioned that the Zodiac Killer talked about the opera The Mikado, Gilbert and Sullivan. And they were like, what is the possibility that someone as young as Louis Myers could have been the Zodiac Killer if he would have been 17 at the time of the first killing, in his late teen years? How on earth would he have familiarity with something like that? Well, even if someone that young wasn't that passionate about Gilbert and Sullivan or something like the opera The Mikado, the way that Earl Van Best got involved with this stuff is his father took him to see the show. And then Gary Stewart goes on to say that Earl Van Best, after going to the show with his father, he really began learning all the things from The Mikado, trying to learn the lines, trying to learn all the lyrics, trying to learn all the words. He really studied that inside and out. And this was because Earl Van Best Sr., Van's father, Earl Van Best Sr. was in Japan as a missionary. He was a career preacher, but he was in Japan as a missionary, got to meet Emperor Hirohito because of his missionary efforts, and they just had this very large connection to Japan. So you have connections to Japan and Mexico, as well as some very specific things that could be tied to the Zodiac, such as the Mikado and code breaking in general. I think that's the biggest point that Gary Stewart wanted us to take away from the first 4 parts of the chapters, that Earl Van Best had complete access to code breaking, and he would have studied cryptography with Earl Van Best Sr. Now, does that mean that Earl Van Best Jr. was the Zodiac Killer? No, absolutely not. I mean, while these are points that are mentioned in the book, very general. I mean, talking about Mexico, Mexico's on the border of California, for goodness sake. Lots of people are going to talk about Mexico. And we even said, though, Robert Graysmith had a connection to Japan as well. And 1940s, when this setting is taking place, Earl Van Best Jr. talking to Earl Van Best Sr., how many people would have had a connection to Japan in the 1940s? Countless individuals would have some connection to Japan and learning anything about the Japanese language that could be involved with the 340 cipher, if that's even true. Because people like Corey Starliper, who claims to have cracked the 340 cipher, says very clearly that there's no Japanese involved in it at all, that is English, and we did an upload on the Corey Starliper solution to the cipher as well, that he says that reveals Arthur Lee Allen. But what I could say about the Earl Van Best theory is it does not receive a lot of support. But to look at the things, though, about the Zodiac Killer in general, I don't think that these elements of animosity toward women should be downplayed. I don't believe that the description and possibility that Gary Stewart has provided for the Zodiac Killer is completely out of line, such as, this is somebody who had an education, a pretty good one, but he was a mediocre student. I mean, if we're dealing with one person, maybe we can kind of just, let's explore the possibility of this being a one person, not the Thomas Henry Horan Zodiac Killer hoax, or not what we call the group murder theory, which is a little bit more expansive than the Zodiac Killer hoax theory. If we're actually dealing with one person here, who could be the Zodiac Killer, it seems like there's a lot of animosity toward women, society, romantic couples, and I gotta tell you, that's why I started endorsing the Louis Myers theory, like when I first put out some Zodiac Killer uploads. I mean, I don't really endorse anything. It's just, I thought that there was a high likelihood that could have been true. It's like, oh, wow, this is why the police got it wrong, because they were looking for somebody much older, when in reality it was Louis Myers, who is quite different. But when I heard the Louis Myers theory, I thought that everything fit like a glove. That you got this guy who has firsthand connections to multiple Zodiac victims, who went to school with one of them, who worked in a restaurant with another one, who was a scorned lover, who felt rejected, who was just being jealous and vengeful. All of those things seemed to come together. When I heard about Earl Van Best as a suspect, I was just like, well, I think this guy is just making stuff up so he can tell his story in a book. He's just making up stuff so he could sell a book. I really didn't feel a very good first-hand reaction to this. In fact, I had a really bad first-hand reaction. My first instinct about the Earl Van Best theory was, this is probably just a dead end. But if we have something to say about it, we can have something to say about it. And a lot of the claims that Gary Stewart is making about Earl Van Best so far in the first 4 chapters are just very general connections. I mean, being familiar with the opera Mikado, that thing ran in the Bay Area. That was performed in the Bay Area for a long time. I mean, there's even things in Richard Gaikowski's newspaper about the opera Mikado, like a publicity advertisement sort of thing. Lots of people have a connection to that. And as we mentioned, lots of people would have grown up with some kind of connection to Japan in the post-World War II era. Lots of people have connections to Mexico. I mean, just as general as that is. But the other thing, though, we should really say about this particular sort of, this particular type of theory, we're going to look for some things, and maybe we can learn about the Zodiac Killer. And in terms of intelligence, we're dealing with someone who is thoughtful, but probably not the biggest success. Maybe not the super academic type like Michael O'Hare or somebody like that. Perhaps someone who maybe was not the most successful in life. Either that or Thomas Horan is just right about this, and then Hal Snook and Robert Graysmith cooked up this myth of the Zodiac Killer hoax, and they tied it into people from the San Francisco Chronicle, and they started putting out false information. So, well, we're not even really sure all the motivations why. When I first started talking about the group murder theory on this channel, I didn't think that it was anything like that. I imagined it was more like 4 or 5 people got together and they're like, we're going to become the most epic serial killer of all time, and then each person is going to commit a single murder, and that would explain all of the differences. The things that I really want to know from Gary Stewart, and we're going to be looking at this as we get into the book. How were the murders committed? Because the feeling that I get here is, this guy has a big life story. He was put up for adoption at 2 months old. He's in Louisiana. He gets a phone call from someone who is saying that she is his birth mother. They get in touch, and then he starts learning about his family history. Now, part of me is just like, did this guy just want to tell his life story, and he needed a better platform to do that? Did this guy just have a lot of life-changing experiences, and did he want a larger audience? Did this guy feel like, wow, there's a lot of stuff I can say about Earl Van Best Jr., but who's going to listen to me? So he tied it into the Zodiac. I don't know how consciously. I'm not a mind reader. I don't know what's in his heart. But I'm curious about that, and we're going to explore that as we continue onward with the book. There's a good story here. I have to tell you, I was like, wow, I could read this as a novel if I just took out the Zodiac Killer stuff, and you got like this kid who was, growing up in the shadow of World War II without a television, so his preacher father is making little cryptograms for him to solve. He taught himself Japanese and German, and his mother is turning into a train wreck. She's putting on this face, playing the organ in church, but she's actually sleeping with the whole town, so they go to San Francisco to get away from it all, and the marriage falls apart, and then all of it just comes down on Van, and then Earl Van Best Jr. just grows up to be some type of chaotic mess. I mean, like, I could read this story, even if it doesn't get to the Zodiac Killer, but I wouldn't have found out about it if it hadn't been for the Zodiac Killer connection. Is there anything going on with that? Well, we're going to have to wait and see. Thank you for listening to part 1 of the Zodiac Killer discussion on The Most Dangerous Animal of All by Gary Stewart. We're going to keep going with this book, but we're also going to be doing some other topics that are going to be coming up this week from time to time. We're never really only going to be doing just one subject here on the channel, but I really appreciate anyone who has listened to the end of this segment and who has heard the introductory piece that we did. So what I can say is, that's going to be all for me now. If you like this upload, you can hit the like button. If you haven't subscribed yet, you're welcome to do so. But most importantly, please drop some comments below so we can continue the discussion. If you have anything to say at all about the Zodiac Killer, about Earl Van Best Jr. as a suspect, or just, I would really like to hear your response to the challenge question. Do you think that the Zodiac Killer was somebody who was rather well educated, but had a little bit subpar performance in school, very good at acquiring knowledge, but just not the biggest professional success in the world? I would love to hear from you. What do you think about that? And until next time.